Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this week's video. Last week we talked a little bit about how to rewire our brain. So essentially we're feeling and thinking more positively. There's actually ways that you can, again, do some brain hacks so that we can start to go outside of our default in case it is anchored in negative emotions and thoughts and bring it to a more positive place. Now this week, I want to talk a little bit about something that's highly technical, but something that I've been learning about, in the last several months. I should note that a lot of the work that I'm about to talk about is basically educated by this doctor. His name is Dr. Joe Dispenza. He spent a lot of his years essentially just studying the brain and how you can essentially rewire it so that you are maximizing your potential. I have really been drawn to his work because he's just been able to really explain the brain in a way that talks about what actually happens in your brain when you are developing habits. I want to talk a little bit about this because I feel that most often we become a slave to our personalities. And I believe that we do have forms of personalities that are governed by our upbringing and also our environment and just some things that we've learned throughout our own lives. But there's actually a way that you can rewire your brain such that you can create new personalities that are just much more tailored to who you really are, but more importantly to who you want to be. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the brain works, what actually happens to your brains when you're having experiences. Now, I should just note that this is not obviously the only thing that happens to your brain, but as Dr. Joe Dispenza have really explained it, there are certain parts of your brain that is associated with experiences. I'm going to simplify it, obviously, because it's the way that he explains it, but it really created a light bulb above me and really empowered me to basically do the work so that I can be the change that I want to see in myself and consequently in the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the brain functions, and then I'm going to give you some tips in terms of what are some of the things that you can do to essentially start to create your own personalities. Oftentimes we adhere to personalities that are no longer serving us. And for me, to have learned this has really, again, empowered me to be the change that I want to see in myself. Okay, so let's get started. The three parts of the brain that I want to focus on, as Dr. Joe Dispenza has explained it, is one, the neocortex. Now, the neocortex is what's known as the seat of your consciousness. This is actually the brain that gets fired up when we are essentially learning something new, when we're reading a book, when we're reading an article, or we're watching a YouTube video, right? This is where it starts to really get stored. There is another part of your brain called the limbic system. The limbic system is the seat of your emotions. When you are experiencing something, it's basically a thought plus your emotions that get triggered, and then it becomes an experience. Your limbic system basically sends chemicals into your body that then creates these emotions. Consequently, both of those elements, the thoughts and emotions, eventually become an experience. The third part of the brain that I want to talk about is essentially called the cerebellum. It is located in the back of your head, and this is also known as the seat of your subconscious. Your subconscious basically takes record of everything that you do, everything that you feel, you think, and more importantly is where your habits are stored. So when you do something consistently, like say brushing your teeth, right? You essentially, when you're learning something, like brushing your teeth, like you're way back when your parents were trying to teach you, it gets stored into your neocortex. Then you start to experience some kind of emotion around it. Then it becomes an experience, and over time, by repetition and by exposure, it eventually becomes you essentially do it on default. So that gets stored in your subconscious. So when you're, like, for instance, when you're driving, right, you don't actually think about driving anymore. What happens is you just go in the car, you automatically turn on the engine, and then you start driving. But you're most often not. It's not coming from your conscious, from a conscious place. The other thing that happens to your brain when you're having an experience or you're having a thought or an emotion is that there are these neurons that essentially come together and they band together. These are the neural networks that are firing together that eventually wires together. So say you are having a thought, right? It gets stored in your neocortex, it starts to wire, there are certain neurons that wire together. Then it becomes an experience when you bring in the emotion, and then by repetition, it starts to really fire together. As they say, what fires together, wires together. And what Dr. Joe Dispenza has suggested is that by the age of 35, we're actually already essentially doing things on default, on autopilot. And so when you think about what is happening to your brain, it's firing together over time, that just becomes really sticky, right? So any sort of habit that, that has formed over time becomes sticky, and those are neurons that are just essentially wired together. Now, most of us would believe that, that personalities cannot be changed. As Dr. Joe Dispenza has explained it, and I have personally experienced it myself, I've actually been able to fire new neural networks together by doing something completely different, where over time, the ones that were predominantly firing together, that's been sticky for so many years, starts to fall away. When you don't use or behave a certain way and you replace it with a new behavior, that neural network that is forming that new behavior starts to fire together, and over time the predominant neural network that used to fire together are no longer used, and so they essentially break away. Now, why do I talk about this? I talk about this because in order for all of us to feel empowered to make the change that we want to have in our lives that eventually serves us well, we have to feel confident that there's actually something going on inside of our brain that we can grasp or understand, so that we can then start to feel motivated to do something different. Now, for me, much of the work that I've done is not just spiritual. I know a lot of people are sort of looking at me and they think that I'm in a boot and I've had a spiritual, journey, and that's absolutely true. But actually, what I've done, more than anything, is work around self-mastery, just understanding who I am, feeling that empowerment to make the change that I want to see in myself, and actually start to see results. So over time, I used to be on default mode around thinking negatively. I've talked about, in the past, where I used to be in PR. So much of the work that I did was actually looking at a particular situation, looking at all aspects of it and seeing what bad thing could potentially happen. This is the work that, PR people do, because we have to look at all angles so that we can then come up with, a narrative or a positioning that's essentially bulletproof. And so my brain was basically wired together such that I had to look at all negative aspects or all negative angles of a particular situation and then come up with a solution. That has essentially translated into my day-to-day life. So I would look at a situation or a person that I'd meet, and I would automatically think about that person and what negative aspects of that person could essentially hurt me. And so I spent a lot of my time seeing the worst in people first, until they prove themselves, which is not really a great way to spend our lives. I've had to rewire my brain such that I could think a lot more positively. So what are the things that I've done, that are actually quite effective? Earlier in my journey, I did a lot of positive affirmations. I would just wake up and I would write down probably a good 30 different affirmations that I wanted to be. So I would say, I am brilliant, I am safe, I am secure, you know, I feel happy, I feel joyful, I am radiant, I feel love. And, you know, and it may feel like that is something that feels a little disingenuous at first because you don't actually feel that way. But actually over time, that's getting downloaded into our subconscious. And over time, we're actually starting to train ourselves to see, you know, the world through that lens, right? I'm seeing more love and more safety and more security. And, you know, and over time, I also started to read a lot of books repetitively that uplifted me, essentially. You know, I would actually use audiobooks as opposed to reading because I'm more auditory, and you know, I would be on my scooter and essentially just put it on, and even if I'm thinking about something else, it's actually, you know, getting downloaded into my subconscious. And one thing that's really, really important so that you are not just firing together new neural networks, you're actually wiring them, is to listen to books or YouTube videos or something that uplifts you repetitively. That sounds so silly, but actually the more that we hear of a particular you know, new concept, the more that we're likely to actually speak it, and then the more likely that we are actually to behave in a certain way. And so to me, positive affirmations work. Just, you know, write them down, write them down on your journal, and just write it down as if you're just doing it repetitively. And I've actually gone to the extent of recording myself and, you know, and basically like listening to it 3 times a day. The other thing too is repetition around books or YouTube, you know, videos that uplift you. To me, like I started to, you know, not just go on a media you know, break, but I've actually translated, or rather replaced that with, you know, books and YouTube videos that actually uplift me, and listen to it repetitively. And over time, I promise you that it actually works, and you start to feel better, and you start to see the world in a different way, a much more positive way. Again, we need to start feeding our brains with things that are nutritious, things that uplift us, so that we can start to really see those positive aspects appear in our lives. I hope that helps you guys. You know, I know that this was a little bit of a dense video, but again, if you guys want to learn more about how the brain works and, you know, the work that Dr. Joe Dispenza has done, I'll create some links down below, and, you know, and you guys can sort of check them out, check his work out. And, you know, and yeah, that's it. Again, see you guys next week, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Love and light as always. Mwah.